In a formal garden in Regent's Park, in the middle of London, behind a great cream-colored house where the American flag flies every day of the year, there is a small bronze statue of a girl. The house is called Winfield House, and it is the official residence of the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. The girl in the garden built it. She named it for her grandfather, and she gave it to the United States outright for $1. I have gone back to that garden more often than I can properly explain, or at least to the fact of it, because it is the one piece of her that is still standing where she left it. The girl in the bronze is Barbara Hutton, and by the time she had that statue made, she had already been for years the most photographed and least understood woman in the world. She was the heiress to the Woolworth 5 and dime fortune. She was called, before she was old enough to understand the words, the poor little rich girl. And she would spend the next 4 decades proving that the phrase was crueler and truer than anyone who coined it intended. Her mother died when she was 4 years old, in an apartment at the Plaza Hotel, and by some accounts the little girl was the one who found her. At 21, she came into a trust that had grown to about $42 million, with nothing in place to protect a single cent of it. She married a Georgian prince, a Danish count, a movie star, a Russian prince, a Dominican playboy, a German tennis champion, and a man whose royal title she reportedly bought for him. One of those 7 husbands, the movie star, asked for nothing and took nothing. Another walked out of a marriage that lasted about 53 days with a cash settlement, a coffee plantation, and a converted bomber. She gave up her American citizenship, and a country that had adored her turned on her in a single season. When she died in a Beverly Hills hotel in 1979, one biographer wrote that she had $3,500 left to her name. And a single necklace she still owned sold decades after her death for more than $27 million. Every one of those things is documented. Not one of them is the strangest part of the story. And several of them, as you will see, are not even true in the way you have been told. This is the story of the richest girl in the world, the dime store heiress who married 7 times and was said to have died with nothing. It is also the story of how almost none of that is true in the way you have been told. How the 50 million was a number the newspapers rounded up to. How the woman who supposedly threw it all away was married out of it, taxed out of it, and grieved out of it. And how the one thing a fortune that size could never buy back, for the child at the center of it, was an ordinary childhood. I want to start in that London garden, with the statue, because everything the fortune ever did to her is easier to see once you know it ends with a bronze child standing on a lawn that is no longer hers. Before we begin, a quick word. If you subscribe, it helps us build a community around stories like this one, and it rewards the work that goes into making them. And it is free. Chapter 1. The Statue in the Garden. Winfield House sits on 12.5 acres of Regent's Park, the second largest private garden in all of central London, smaller only than the one behind Buckingham Palace. It is a neo-Georgian mansion of red brick and pale stone, and it has flown the American flag since 1955, when it became the home of every United States ambassador to Britain since. Presidents have stayed there, kings and queens have dined there. The garden parties are famous, and out in the parterre garden, among the clipped hedges and the roses, there is a bronze figure of a young girl that most visitors walk past without a second look, because there is no obvious reason for an American heiress to be cast in bronze on a London lawn. The girl is Barbara Hutton, and the house is hers in a way that no plaque quite captures. She built it in the 1930s on the site of an older villa, tore that villa down and put up in its place one of the grandest private homes in London. She named it Winfield House, after her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, the man whose nickels and dimes had paid for all of it. She hired a London architect and had the old villa on the site pulled down, and over about 15 months, finishing in 1938, she raised in its place one of the grandest private houses in the city. Her only child was born inside it. During the war, the grounds were handed to the Royal Air Force, and a barrage balloon crew flew their great silver balloons from her lawn while she was an ocean away. And then, in 1946, with the house battered and the world changed, she gave the whole thing to the government of the United States for a single $1, and President Truman accepted the gift in a personal letter. After a long renovation, it became, and remains, the residence of the American ambassador. I have stood, in my mind, in that garden many times, and I find it hard to walk past that statue quickly. Of everything the Woolworth fortune bought, and it bought a great deal, this small bronze child is very nearly the only piece of it still standing where Barbara Hutton put it. The palaces were sold. The jewels were scattered across the auction houses of the world. The 7 husbands are all dead. The fortune itself is simply gone, dispersed so completely that no accountant has ever been able to say precisely where the last of it went. But the statue remains, in a garden that belongs to a country she formally gave up her citizenship in, behind a house she gave away for $1. There is something almost unbearably neat about it. The child cast in metal, standing still on the one piece of ground the fortune touched that she could not later lose, because she had already given it to somebody else. The house is a listed building now, protected by the British government as a place of historic interest, which means the statue is safe in a way almost nothing else in her life turned out to be. She could not keep the fortune. She could not keep a marriage. She could not, at the last, keep herself. But the bronze girl in the garden will be standing there long after everyone who ever read a headline about her is gone. There is a temptation, standing there, to read the whole life backward from the bronze, to decide that a woman who ends up as a statue in someone else's garden must have been a tragic figure from the beginning, doomed, marked, the poor little rich girl of the headlines. But that is the easy version, and the easy version is where most of the myths about Barbara Hutton live. The harder version is that she was, for a while, one of the richest and most envied human beings alive, and that the ruin was neither inevitable nor entirely her doing. To understand how the girl in the garden came to give it all away, you have to go back before the garden, before the marriages, before the statue. You have to go back past Barbara Hutton entirely, to a time before she was born, before her mother was born, to a shop counter in a small Pennsylvania city where a failed clerk with almost nothing to his name was about to try, for the second time, to sell things for 5 cents. Everything that happened to the girl in the garden began at that counter, with a man who could not have imagined her, spending money he did not yet have. Chapter 2. Nickels and Dimes. Frank Winfield Woolworth was not, by the standards of the men he would eventually eclipse, a natural merchant. He was a farmer's son from Rodman, New York, awkward with customers, and his first attempt at his own idea, a store that sold everything for 5 cents, opened in Utica, New York in the winter of 1879 and failed within months. The location was poor, the novelty wore off. He was, by every account of that year, a young man who had staked his small savings on a strange notion and watched it collapse. Then, on the 21st of June, 1879, he tried again, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this time it worked. The first day took in $127.65. He added 10-cent goods to the 5-cent ones, and the fixed low price, the open counters where customers could handle the merchandise without asking a clerk, the sheer volume of cheap, useful things, turned out to be one of the most powerful ideas in the history of American retail. He bought directly from the manufacturers, cutting out the middlemen, and he built his whole promise on the idea that an ordinary person could walk in, see the price on everything, touch the goods without a clerk hovering, and leave having spent a nickel or a dime on something useful. Woolworth did not invent the store that sold small things cheaply. He perfected it, and then he multiplied it until the red-fronted 5 and dime with his gold name across the window stood on main streets in every corner of the country. By 1900, he had 59 stores and more than $5 million in sales. By 1900, there were dozens of stores. By the time he merged with 5 of his rivals in 1911, folding them into a single company, there were nearly 600 stores under the Woolworth name. And in 1913, at the peak of it, Frank Woolworth built himself a monument. The Woolworth Building, on Broadway in Lower Manhattan, designed by the architect Cass Gilbert, rose 792 feet into the air and was, for 17 years, the tallest building in the world. Woolworth paid for it in cash, roughly $13.5 million in an age when that was a nearly unimaginable sum, handed over without a mortgage, because the nickels and dimes had added up to that. It held the record as the tallest building on Earth until 1930, when the Chrysler Building finally passed it, and people called it the Cathedral of Commerce. And it was, in the most literal sense, a cathedral built out of small change. The man who had failed in Utica a little more than 30 years before now owned the tallest thing human beings had ever built, and he owned it free and clear. It is worth sitting with the arithmetic of that fortune for a moment, because it explains a jibe that would follow his granddaughter for the rest of her life. Every dollar of the Woolworth money came in 5 and 10 cents at a time, across the counters of stores whose entire promise was that poor people could afford what was on the shelves. The fortune was built, quite literally, out of the small change of working Americans, coin by coin, in towns where a nickel was a real decision. When that granddaughter later spent it on Georgian princes and Moroccan palaces and necklaces that cost more than a Woolworth store manager would earn in several lifetimes, the newspapers did not have to reach for the contrast. It was already there, in the founding fact of the money. The distance between the shop counter and the palace was the distance the whole story would travel, in one direction, and never come back. Frank Woolworth died in 1919, a few years after the tower opened. He had 3 daughters, Edna, Jessie, and Helena, and the fortune he left would pass down through them, but it would not pass cleanly or kindly. It would move through the family the way such fortunes often do, by way of a series of deaths. And the first of those deaths, the one that shaped everything after it, had already happened 2 years earlier, in an apartment at the Plaza Hotel. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is the thing that keeps stories like this one finding their way to people. Chapter 3. The Apartment at the Plaza. On the 2nd of May, 1917, Edna Woolworth Hutton was found dead in the family's apartment at the Plaza Hotel in New York. She was 33 years old. She was the middle of Frank Woolworth's 3 daughters, and she had married a stockbroker named Franklin Laws Hutton, a partner in the brokerage founded by his brother Edward, the firm that carried the family name across the country, a charming and heavy-drinking man whose affairs were, by the time of her death, an open subject in their circle. The official cause was given as complications of a chronic ear infection, a mastoiditis that had turned septic. There was no autopsy. Almost from the moment the news broke, there was another version. In that version, Edna Hutton did not die of an infected ear. She took her own life in her husband's apartment worn down by his drinking and his women, and the family used its money and its name to keep the word suicide off the record and out of the papers. That version has never been proven. It rests on rumor, on the absence of an autopsy, and on the accounts of a biographer whose reliability is itself in question. The honest thing to say is that we do not know how Edna Hutton died, only that the way she died was arranged, very quickly, to trouble the family as little as possible. In an age when a suicide in a prominent family was a scandal that clung for generations, the absence of an autopsy and the speed of the official account are the kind of details that invite exactly the suspicion they were meant to prevent. Whatever happened in that apartment, the machinery of wealth had already begun doing the thing it would go on doing again and again across the whole length of her life, which is to close a difficult question before anyone could insist on asking it. What is not in dispute is who was in the apartment. Edna's daughter was 4 years old, and by the accounts that have come down, she was the one who found her mother, or was at least there when the body was found. Barbara Hutton was 4. Whatever the truth of the mastoiditis and the whispers, the fact at the center is simply that a small girl lost her mother in a hotel apartment and grew up understanding that the loss was something not to be discussed. I want to be careful here because it is very easy, with a life like this one, to reach for the childhood wound and use it to explain everything that follows, as if a person were a machine and grief were the lever. Barbara Hutton was not only her mother's death, but it is also true that nearly everyone who knew her across 60 years described the same thing at the core of her, a loneliness that no amount of money or company ever filled. And it is fair to trace that loneliness back to that room at the plaza. She spent the rest of her life surrounded by people and convinced, correctly more often than not, that they were there for the money. It is one thing to be lonely. It is another to be lonely and rich, because the wealth removes the ordinary evidence by which a person learns who actually cares for them. Everyone was kind to Barbara Hutton. Almost no one was safe. Her father did not take her in and raise her. Franklin Hutton was a distant parent even by the standards of wealthy men of his era, and Barbara was passed among relatives and grandparents and governesses, cared for materially in every way and emotionally in almost none. She lived for a time with her grandfather Woolworth at Winfield Hall, his enormous 60-room mansion on the North Shore of Long Island, and later among aunts and cousins in a childhood that had every comfort and no fixed center. One cousin in particular, a boy named Jimmy Donahue, another Woolworth heir, became her closest companion and, by many accounts, the person who first put barbiturates in front of her, long before she was grown. The company she was given was the company of other rich, restless, unhappy children. She was given everything a child could be given, except the two things that had just been taken from her, which were a mother and a father's attention. And all the while, in the background, the money was accumulating, growing in trust, waiting for her. It was coming toward her like weather, and there was no one in her life with both the standing and the will to teach her what it was, or what it would attract before it arrived. Chapter 4. The Trust. The money reached Barbara Hutton the way it had reached her mother, through a death. Her grandmother, Jenny Creighton Woolworth, died in 1924. Frank Woolworth had, by one persistent account, failed to sign a revised will before his own death 5 years earlier, so the fortune had passed first to his widow, and now, on Jenny's death, it split among the 3 daughters' lines. Barbara, whose mother Edna was gone, took her mother's third. She was 11 years old. The sum placed in trust for her was about $26 million, with a further $2 million or so coming to her from her late mother's estate. In the money of the 1920s, that was a colossal fortune, and by the reckonings that try to translate it forward, the 26 million of 1924 would be worth something on the order of $370 million today, and the fortune at its peak has been put, in current money, at close to $1 billion. It was managed, until she came of age, by her father. And here, the record does Franklin Hutton a genuine credit, whatever kind of parent he was. He was a shrewd man with money, if not with his daughter, and he is generally credited with moving the trust into safer holdings, into bonds, before the stock market collapsed in 1929. While much of American wealth was wiped out in the crash, Barbara's fortune did not shrink. It grew. By her 21st birthday, in 1933, the trust that had started at about $26 million had reached something close to $42 million. That is the real figure, or as close to a real figure as the record allows, and it is worth pausing on because the number the world attached to her was larger. 50 million made a better headline than 42. 100 million made a better one still. And so the woman herself began, even in the accounting of her own fortune, to disappear behind a number that was never quite real. A habit of exaggeration that would eventually make it just as easy to believe, at the other end of her life, that she had died with nothing at all. The number that followed Barbara Hutton around was 50 million, sometimes 100 million, sometimes more. Those were the round numbers of the tabloid press, inflated for effect. The defensible figure is something like 26 million held in trust when she was a child, grown to around 42 million by the time she could touch it. Enormous. But already, in the gap between 42 and the mythic 50, you can see the machine that would define her public life, the machine that took the facts of Barbara Hutton and rounded them up into something better for selling papers. There is a second thing about that trust, and it matters more than the exact figure. There was nothing protecting it. No structure held the money back, released it in stages, or kept a trustee's hand on the principal once she was grown. On her 21st birthday, the entire fortune passed to her, outright and unguarded, to do with as she and the people around her wished. She was reportedly so grateful to her father for having grown it through the crash that she made him a gift of some $5 million in thanks. Financial advisors now use her case as a lesson in exactly what not to do. The fortune handed whole to a young person with no spendthrift clause, no staged release, no trustee left holding the principal, nothing at all to protect her from either the fortune hunters or herself. So consider the young woman who stood at the center of it in 1933. She was 21 years old. She had lost her mother at 4 and been raised by almost no one. She had more money than she could count, and no training in what to do with it, and no one whose love for her she could fully trust. She was, on paper, the luckiest girl alive. She was one of the loneliest, and about to become one of the most hunted. The fortune that her grandfather had built, one dime at a time, and that her father had shielded through the worst crash in the country's history, was now hers to keep or to lose. And the world she was about to walk into was full of people who had studied, with real care, the problem of how to separate a lonely young woman from a very large amount of money. Hit subscribe if you want the next part of this. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. Poor Little Rich Girl. The phrase did not begin with her. Poor Little Rich Girl was the title of a 1913 stage play by Eleanor Gates about a wealthy child neglected by her busy parents and left to the care of servants. And it became a Mary Pickford silent film in 1917, the same year Edna Hutton died. The phrase was already in the air, a ready-made piece of sentiment about the emptiness behind money, when the columnists of the 1930s went looking for someone to hang it on. Barbara Hutton fit it so perfectly that within a few years the phrase and the woman were fused, and it followed her into every headline for the rest of her life. What sealed it was her debut. In December of 1930, at 17 going on 18, Barbara was formally introduced to society at a ball that reportedly cost around $60,000. That figure, whatever its precise accuracy, was the problem, because the year was 1930. The country was sliding into the worst economic collapse in its history. Men who had worked all their lives were selling apples on street corners, and the newspapers carried, side by side, photographs of bread lines and photographs of the Woolworth heiress being presented to society in a room banked with imported flowers. The contrast wrote itself. A New York paper sneered that she was spending, no one could say how many, millions of American nickels and dimes collected from poor people. The founding fact of the fortune had come back around. The columnist Walter Winchell took to calling her, with the cruelty that sold papers, society's most outrageous child, and the humorist Ogden Nash spun light verse at her expense. She had become, before she was 20, a national character, and the character was not kind. Here is what I think is easy to miss from this distance. Barbara Hutton did not choose to be the face of obscene wealth in the middle of a depression. She was 17. The ball was arranged for her, around her, by the adults who ran her life. But the public does not forgive on the basis of who arranged the party, and by the time she was of age, she was already a fixed character in the American imagination, less a person than a symbol, the spoiled girl with everything who would surely never know a day of real trouble. It was a role assigned to her before she had done anything at all, and she would spend her whole life either playing it or failing to escape it. To get away from the cameras, she was sent abroad, to Europe, where an American heiress with a fortune was a very particular kind of prize. She was stepping into an old tradition, older than she was, older than the fortune. For decades, wealthy American families had sent their daughters across the Atlantic to trade New World money for Old World titles. The so-called dollar princesses, who became countesses and duchesses and marchionesses and paid for the crumbling estates of the European aristocracy with railroad and steel and retail fortunes. It was a market, frankly, a market in which American cash bought European rank, and European rank lent American cash a coat of ancient respectability, and everyone involved understood the terms. Barbara wanted, by many accounts, exactly that. She had grown up plain Miss Hutton, motherless and famous for the wrong reasons, and the idea of becoming a princess, of trading the dime store name for something with a crown attached, had a powerful hold on her. Europe was full of men who understood that hold precisely, and who had titles to sell, or the appearance of titles, which for these purposes was the same thing. One family in particular had made a business of it. They were called the Mdivanis, and there were several of them, brothers and sisters who had turned marriage into a livelihood, and by the time Barbara arrived in their orbit, they were already known, in the gossip columns that tracked such things, by a nickname that told you everything. They were the marrying Mdivanis. Their claim to be Georgian princes was thin, the sort of title that had drifted loose in the chaos after the Russian Revolution and attached itself to a family with charm and ambition and very little else. But the charm was real, and it was aimed, with great precision, at rich and unhappy women. The eldest of the brothers, a handsome, athletic, self-described prince named Alexis Mdivani, was about to become the first of Barbara Hutton's 7 husbands, and the pattern that would define her life was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Marrying Mdivanis. Alexis Mdivani married Barbara Hutton in Paris in the summer of 1933, weeks before her 21st birthday, in a wedding that drew crowds into the streets. He was one of 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and among them the Devanis had already married a remarkable roster of rich and titled people, enough that the gossip columns had given them the name that stuck: the marrying Devanis. It was not meant as a compliment. It was a description of a business, and a fairly successful one. Between them, the brothers and sisters had married a Spanish painter's fortune, an American singer, a Hollywood star, and now the greatest heiress of them all. Their claim to royal blood was threadbare, one of the many titles set loose and unverifiable after the collapse of the old order in the East. But a title did not need to be real to be useful. It needed only to sound real in a headline, and to flatter a young woman who wanted very badly to be a princess. Barbara's father understood exactly what his daughter was walking into, and he did the only thing a man of his kind knew how to do about it, which was to negotiate. Before the wedding, Franklin Hutton reportedly settled a dowry of about $1 million on the prince, an arrangement that treated the marriage as what it partly was, a transaction, while pretending it was something else. It is a strange thing to give a man $1 million to marry your daughter and to imagine you have thereby protected her. But that was the logic of the world Barbara lived in, where money was the language everyone spoke, and where the surest way to be loved for your money was to keep handing it to the people who wanted it. The dowry did not buy her a faithful husband. It bought the family the appearance of having done things properly, of having managed the transaction. And it taught Barbara, at 20, the lesson she would spend the rest of her life failing to unlearn: that affection was something you paid for and then kept paying for, or watched leave. The marriage lasted about 2 years, and by the standards of what came later, it was not even close to the worst of them. Alexis was vain and expensive, but he was not cruel, and he did not try to take from her the things that could not be replaced. Alexis spent freely on houses and polo ponies and cars and the general upkeep of being a prince, and Barbara paid for it. And when it ended in 1935, he walked away several $1 million richer than he had arrived. Weeks after the divorce, driving fast on a coast road in Spain with a companion beside him, he lost control of his Rolls-Royce and was killed. He was 30 years old. Barbara, who had already moved on to her second husband, reportedly wept when she heard, which tells you something about her that the headlines never did. She kept a tenderness even for the men who had used her. She seems never to have quite believed that the using was all it had been, and perhaps, in some of them, it was not. I want to slow down here because the pattern that is forming is the one that would repeat with variations for the next 30 years, and it is easy to describe it in a way that makes Barbara Hutton a fool. She was not a fool. She was a highly intelligent, deeply lonely woman who wanted two things that her fortune made almost impossible to obtain together, which were to be loved, and to be loved by someone impressive. The title, the crown, the ancient name, these were not simply vanity. They were her attempt to be worth something in a currency other than dollars, to be a princess rather than a dime store heiress. And the men who could offer her that were, almost by definition, the men who most wanted the dollars. Even before Mdivani was in the ground, Barbara had married again. This time, the man was a Danish count, and this time, the price would not be measured in millions of dollars. It would be measured in something she could not simply write a check to replace. Subscribing is how stories like this keep finding their way to you, and it is free. Chapter 7. The Oath. Count Kurt von Haugwitz Hardenberg Reventlow was a Danish nobleman, and he married Barbara Hutton in 1935, the same year her first marriage ended. On the 24th of February 1936, in the great house she had just built in Regent's Park, Barbara gave birth to her only child, a son, Lance Reventlow. For a moment, the story looked as though it might turn towards something ordinary. A mother, a child, a home with a name carved over the door. It did not. The marriage was, by the accounts that survive, the most frightening of her life. Reventlow was controlling and, by several accounts, violent, and there were reports that he beat her badly enough to require hospital care. But the lasting damage he did was not only physical. Reventlow persuaded Barbara to do something that would turn the whole country against her, something that struck at the one part of her identity that the public had, until then, allowed her to keep. He persuaded her to give up her American citizenship. The reasoning was about money, as it always was. As an American, Barbara faced enormous taxes, and above all the prospect that when she died, the United States would take a large share, by some accounts as much as 2/3, of her estate. If she became a citizen of another country, that exposure shrank, and the fortune her grandfather had assembled would pass to her heirs closer to whole. And so, in a New York courtroom in December of 1937, Barbara Hutton formally renounced her citizenship of the United States and took Danish nationality in its place. On paper, it was tax planning of the sort that wealthy families did quietly all the time. In the eyes of the American public, when it learned of it, it was a betrayal, and not a quiet one. The reaction when it came in 1938 was ferocious, and it came from a direction that carried a terrible logic. The Woolworth fortune had been built out of the nickels and dimes of ordinary Americans. Now the heiress to that fortune had taken those millions and renounced the country the customers lived in, apparently to avoid paying it taxes. Woolworth employees, many of them working for wages so low they could barely live on them, were among the loudest voices. There were reports of workers wiring her directly, urging the company to pay a living wage to the thousands who were, in their words, existing on starvation wages, while the woman whose name was on their inheritance sailed the world as a Danish countess. The newspapers that had built her up as the poor little rich girl now tore into her as something close to a traitor. Editorials called her conduct despicable. Members of Congress made speeches. For a woman who had done nothing that a dozen quieter fortunes were not also doing, she became, in a single season of 1938, the most publicly hated heiress in America. And the hatred had that special edge that is reserved for people who are felt to have insulted the humble source of their own good luck. I find this the saddest turn in the whole story, and also the clearest. Because the thing the public could not forgive was, at its heart, the same thing that had defined her since she was 4 years old. Barbara Hutton had always been valued as money, and treated as money. And here the country did it too. When she renounced her citizenship, the nation that had adored her as a symbol turned on her as a symbol, and almost no one on either side treated the actual woman, a young mother in a violent marriage acting on the advice of the man hurting her, as a person at all. She was a fortune that had insulted the people the fortune came from. That was the whole of it. She divorced Reventlow, and a long and bitter fight over their son followed, one of the most public custody battles of the era. The Count was given custody until the boy reached school age, and before he would give him up, he sent Lance to Canada. And Barbara did not get her son back until 1945. She got her son back in 1945, but the years in between, the courts, the crossings, the boy used as a piece in a fight between adults, had marked all of them. She would spend the rest of her life trying to be loved by people who wanted the money, and never quite understanding that the wanting was the thing that made it impossible. Chapter 8. Cash and Carry. In July of 1942, Barbara Hutton married the most famous man she would ever marry. and for once the marriage confused everyone, because on paper it made no sense. He did not need her money. The columnists reached for the obvious joke and dubbed the couple Cash and Carey, and waited for the pattern to repeat. It did not repeat. Cary Grant is the exception that explains all the others. Grant was already one of the biggest film stars in the world and independently wealthy, and by every account of the marriage he sought nothing from Barbara and took nothing from her. When they divorced in 1945, he asked for no settlement and accepted none. Years later, when she had almost nothing left, he remained fond of her. And he became, quietly, a lasting figure in the life of her son, Lance. A kind of steady, affectionate presence that the boy's own father had never been. Of the 7 men Barbara Hutton married, the one the public treated as the least serious, the movie star, the punchline of the Cash and Carey joke, was the only one who asked her for nothing and loved her for free. He would visit her decades later when she was ill and nearly out of money and most of the crowd had drifted off, and he stayed kind to her to the end of her life. It is worth stopping on what that means, because the story is usually told as a tale of a foolish woman robbed again and again by fortune hunters, and Cary Grant breaks that telling in half. If every one of her husbands had taken her money, you could call it her bad luck or her bad judgment and move on. But one of them did not. One of them wanted nothing, and that single exception reframes all the others, because it shows that the problem was never that rich women are always robbed. The problem was that Barbara, specifically, kept choosing, or being steered toward, men for whom she was a fortune first and a woman second. Cary Grant proved it did not have to be that way. It simply, for her, almost always was. And it is worth asking why. By the standards of the women she was compared to, she was neither foolish nor naive. She read, she wrote poetry, she spoke several languages, she saw people clearly. What she could not do was believe, at the deepest level, that anyone would stay without being paid, because the first and largest fact of her life was that the person who should have stayed for free had not. After Grant came the others, and by now the shape is familiar enough that they can be named without dwelling. In 1947, she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian-French aristocrat and racing driver, a man of limited means. That marriage ended by the start of the 1950s, and around its end, she reportedly attempted to take her own life, a detail the papers printed in a sentence or two and then moved past on their way to the next wedding. In 1955, she married an old friend, the German tennis champion Baron Gottfried von Cramm, a genuinely decent man by most accounts, and one of the few husbands who seems to have wanted her rather than her money, though that marriage too came apart within a few years, worn down by the same restlessness that undid all the others. And in 1964, she married her 7th and final husband, a Vietnamese Lao chemist and painter for whom she reportedly purchased a princely title connected to a former royal house, so that she could, at the very end of her marrying life, become a princess after all. 7 husbands. A prince, a count, a movie star, another prince, a playboy, a baron, and a man whose title she bought so that she could end her marrying life as the princess she had wanted to be at the start of it. Laid out in a row like that, they look like the appetites of a frivolous woman, a collector of men and crowns. Looked at one at a time, they look like something sadder and more human, a person trying the same door over and over, certain that this time it would open onto the thing she had been missing since she was 4 years old, in an apartment at the plaza. If you are still with me this deep into her life, then these are the ones I make for you. Subscribe and I will keep making them. Chapter 9. The Palace and the Plantation. Between the marriages and around them and through them, Barbara Hutton spent money on a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. Her fifth husband gives the clearest single illustration. In December of 1953, she married the Dominican playboy and diplomat Porfirio Rubirosa, perhaps the most famous seducer of the century, a man of enormous charm and few visible scruples who had already been married to another great American heiress, and who would surface again, strangely, at the very end of her life. The marriage lasted, by most accounts, about 53 days. When it was over, Rubirosa left with a settlement that reportedly included a large sum of cash, a string of polo ponies, a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic, and a converted B-25 bomber that had been remade as a private aircraft. 53 days, a plantation and a bomber. The arithmetic of that marriage says everything about the decade around it. The money went out in every direction at once. There was the palace in Tangier, a place called Sidi Hosni, in the old walled Kasbah above the sea, assembled from several houses into one, where Barbara threw parties that people still described in awed detail decades later, with musicians and dancers and men who had come down from the Atlas Mountains, and Barbara receiving her guests from a raised seat covered in gold. There were the jewels, some of the greatest in private hands anywhere in the world, emeralds that had belonged to a Russian Grand Duchess, a string of pearls said to have once belonged to Marie Antoinette, a tiara, and the jade necklace her father had given her at her first wedding, a rope of large green beads that would, decades after her death, turn out to be worth more than all the rest. These were pieces with the kind of history that attaches to objects that outlast the people who wear them, and Barbara wore them the way other people wear clothes. There were houses in Paris and Mexico and California, a Japanese-style estate she built near Cuernavaca, staffs to run all of them, and travel with dozens of trunks and a retinue, and a general rate of spending that no fortune, however large, could sustain forever. Money that had taken her grandfather a lifetime of dimes to gather, she could move through in a season. And there were the people around her, the advisors and lawyers and hangers-on, some devoted, some not. Her money passed through the hands of managers whose deals were not always in her interest, among them a longtime lawyer named Graham Madison, whose arrangements, by some accounts, did the estate real harm. She gave money away constantly, to friends, to staff, to strangers with a good story, to causes that caught her, funding soup kitchens in Tangier during a famine, handing out sums that would have been fortunes to the people who received them. Her generosity was real, unlike almost everything that was done back to her, and it was one more channel through which the money quietly ran out. She could not buy loyalty, so she bought presents, and the presents, too, added up. I have to be careful not to turn this into a simple ledger of waste, because underneath the spending was a woman who was genuinely and seriously unwell. Barbara Hutton suffered from anorexia for most of her adult life, at a time when the illness had barely a name, and by the end, she reportedly weighed under 100 pounds and lived largely on liquid and cigarettes, and the pills she had been introduced to as a girl. She was in chronic pain, some of it real and some of it treated into being. She was dependent on drugs and on alcohol, and had been steered toward both since girlhood by the very people meant to care for her. The parties and the palaces and the jewels can look, from outside, like pure indulgence. But they were also the distractions of a person who was, in a very literal sense, disappearing, and who had never in her life been given the ordinary tools for being well. Then, on the 24th of July, 1972, the one thing she had that mattered more than any of it was taken from her. Her son Lance, by then a grown man who had made his own name as a race car driver and builder, was flying in a small chartered plane over the mountains of Colorado when the pilot, unfamiliar with the terrain, flew into a box canyon in bad weather and could not climb out. Lance Reventlow was killed along with the 3 others aboard. He was 36 years old, the same age his mother had been when the marriages were at their most frantic, and he left behind a young widow and a life that had, unlike his mother's, been largely his own making. After that, the people close to her said, something in Barbara simply closed. The spending went on, but the pleasure was gone from it. She had outlived the one person whose love for her had never once been in question, the child born in the London house, and there was nothing left in any shop or vault in the world that she wanted. Chapter 10. What the Necklace Was Worth. Barbara Hutton died on the 11th of May 1979 of a heart attack in a penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills. She was 66 years old. She had been living in her last years as a near recluse in that hotel, bedridden and frail, cared for by a small staff, visited by a few loyal friends, and by her cousin's daughter. When she was buried in the Woolworth family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, beside the mother she had lost when she was 4 years old, the accounts say that about 10 people came. One of the richest women who had ever lived was seen into the ground by roughly the number of guests you might invite to a small dinner. And then there is the number that everyone remembers about Barbara Hutton, the last of her myths, and the one most in need of correcting. The claim, repeated in 1,000 retellings, is that Barbara Hutton, one of the richest women in the history of the world, died broke, with just $3,500 to her name. It is a perfect, terrible detail, and it is the kind of detail that a story like hers reaches for, because it completes the arc so cleanly, from 50 million to nothing. But it needs to be handled with care, because it is not quite true, and where it came from matters. The $3,500 figure traces, as far as the record shows, to a single biography published 4 years after her death, a book whose reliability was questioned so seriously that its own publisher recalled the first printing over factual errors. The figure appears to describe the cash in her personal checking and savings accounts at the end, not the value of her estate. And her estate was not nothing. When her affairs were settled, it turned out that Barbara Hutton had held on, right to the end, to many of her most important jewels, some of the most extraordinary in private hands anywhere. And there is one object that measures the gap between the penniless heiress of the myth and the truth better than any ledger could. The necklace of large jadeite beads that her father had given her as a wedding present in 1933, when she married the first of the Mdivanis, the rope of green stones she had worn at her 21st birthday, passed through a series of hands in the years after her death. And in the spring of 2014, in a sale room in Hong Kong, it sold for more than $27 million, a world record for jade, to the House of Cartier, which had made it. One necklace out of her life was worth, by itself, more than $27 million, in the same story in which she is remembered for having died with 3,500. So here is the accurate version, which is stranger and sadder than the myth. Barbara Hutton did not die a pauper in the literal sense. She died in a hotel penthouse, still holding objects worth tens of millions of dollars. What she had run out of was not wealth exactly, but liquidity. And long before that, everything the wealth was supposed to provide. She had spent and been robbed of and been taxed of and given away a fortune that at its height was worth, in today's money, close to $1 billion, until there was almost no cash left to run her life, even as a single necklace in a vault could have funded a small country. Died broke is the wrong phrase for it. She died in a hotel penthouse, still holding tens of millions of dollars in jewels she had no use for, having spent 40 years running out of everything the wealth was meant to provide, and never quite running out of the wealth. There is one more comparison that finishes the thought. Barbara Hutton was not the only girl called the richest in the world in her generation. There was another, Doris Duke, the tobacco heiress, born the same year, so alike in their circumstances that the papers called the two of them the Golden Dust Twins, and who, in one of history's small, cruel jokes, married the very same Porfirio Rubirosa that Barbara did. But Doris Duke was careful where Barbara was open-handed, shrewd where Barbara was trusting. And when Doris Duke died in 1993, she left a fortune of well over $1 billion, most of it to a foundation that still bears her name and still does her work. The same Head Start, the same century, the same husband even, and two completely different endings. Which tells you that what happened to Barbara Hutton was not the inevitable fate of a rich woman. It was the particular fate of this one. Let me step back now because the chronology is finished, and the chronology was never really the point. It would be easy to take all of this and turn it into a lesson about money, a tidy warning that wealth does not buy happiness, that the poor little rich girl had it coming, that she should have been more careful, more sensible, more like Doris Duke. That is the version the tabloids sold for 50 years, and it is the version I want to reject because it asks the wrong question. The question was never why she failed to hold on to the money. The question is why almost no one in 66 years ever offered her anything but the money. What strikes me, after going back through all of it, is that Barbara Hutton was given, at 4 years old, a wound that a fortune is uniquely bad at healing, and then handed the fortune and told it should be enough. She wanted what the poorest child in any Woolworth store might have had: a mother, a father who saw her, a person who wanted her for no reason. Instead, she got the largest pile of nickels and dimes in the world, and a lifetime of people who loved the pile. The fortune was never the disease. It was a poultice pressed to the wrong wound. She had been handed the largest pile of money in the world and told it should be enough to heal a thing that money has never once healed, and then blamed, for 60 years, for spending it looking elsewhere for the cure. What survived her is easy to inventory. The jewels survived and were sold. The palaces survived under new owners. The Woolworth name survived on storefronts for a while longer, and then it too went. The company renamed and renamed again until it sold sneakers under a different name entirely. What did not survive was the fortune, which dispersed so completely that no one can fully trace it, and the woman herself, who had been disappearing since she was a girl. And one thing more survived, which almost no one thinks to count. In a formal garden in Regent's Park, behind a great cream-colored house where the American flag flies every day of the year, there is still a small bronze statue of a girl. The house is Winfield House, the residence of the United States ambassador, the mansion Barbara Hutton built, named for her grandfather, and gave to the American government for $1. She gave up her citizenship in that country, and the country flew its flag over her house anyway. And in the garden, the bronze girl she had made stands among the hedges, not aging, not asking for anything, looking at nothing in particular. She could not keep the fortune. She could not keep a husband, or her health, or her son, or her country, or, in the end, herself. The statue is the one thing she put down somewhere that could not be taken, married away, taxed away, or spent, for the simple reason that she had already given it away on purpose. The house belongs to another country now, and the fortune belongs to no one, and the girl in the garden is cast in bronze, and she does not age, and she is still there. This is the kind of story this channel exists for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.